as Christy said, I'm going to do two things today, and actually I changed my title slightly to reflect that. I'm going to start off just highlighting the main issues that are affecting rattlesnakes in BC right now, and I'm sure a lot of those will not be of any surprise, especially to this group. And then I will give you a really quick tour of some, not all, of the research projects we've been running on the rattlesnake for the last half dozen years or so. And I'll try to stay very conscious of the time and leave space at the end for questions. So I guess we'll just get started here. And I think we'll just get started here. There we go. So I've had a long standing interest in rattlesnakes and snakes in general. I think I was about, I don't know, 5 years old when I told my mother and father I was going to be a biologist, and it took me about 2 more years to narrow it down to herpetology. But it's been something I've focused on, I'd say, for the last 24 years that I've been at TRU. And I think back to when I really got started and realized that there was a lot of questions to be answered about rattlesnakes was when I got my first summer job. I was probably about 23 years old, and I got my first summer job working with a graduate student at Vernon on rattlesnakes. And there's me in my field gear. As you can see, things were literally a little bit more cowboy back then. We didn't have as well thought out ways to handle the animals. So this is how we captured rattlesnakes, and a lot of the times this is how we got information from them. I certainly would not recommend this now to anyone. And if one of my students was doing this, I would probably keel haul them and say, you're not going back out in the field. So times have changed. But, when we did this research in the mid 80s, rattlesnakes were still considered pretty common and not threatened. And so much has changed in the last 35 years. One of the things I want to get people to appreciate right at the start here is that we do not have ideal climate for rattlesnakes here in British Columbia. Those of us in the Okanagan or the Thompson really pride ourselves on these hot, dry summers that we have. And certainly last summer really gave us a taste of what could be at the extreme. But even with that, our summers are relatively poor compared to where rattlesnakes live over most of their range. We are at the northern limit for rattlesnakes in the world, and the summers are we are relatively warm compared to the rest of Canada, but compared to Arizona or New Mexico or even inland Oregon, it's quite different. Our summers are cooler. Yes, I know it's hard to believe that after last year, but we do have relatively cool summers. And also, just as important is our summers are not that long. So even before people come into the picture here, the rattlesnakes living in BC have to deal with relatively cool, short summers. We have long, cold winters. Of course, that's the opposite of the summers. And so the snakes must find places where they can get through the winter. They just can't crawl under a log like they might do down in Arizona. And that means migration. So our rattlesnakes undergo fairly lengthy migrations that can take them from, high in the cliffs where they den, where they can safely get through the winter, to where they spend the summer foraging or reproducing. And then they got to make that back. And that eats up time. Not only do you have the energy of traveling back and forth, but it takes away time from other things like feeding. And this has, of course, led to the rather, infamous communal den of rattlesnakes that most people know about. And it's true, most of our rattlesnakes den with other animals, and that's not because they really probably benefit from denning with other snakes. It's simply because there's a set number of places where getting through the winter is fairly assured. And this has been a big boost to us because that means we can access a lot of animals in the spring and fall that we would have a hard time getting to if we were trying to run around and catch them all. So one more thing I'll add to our list here is that prey in our grasslands is relatively scarce from what we can tell. We have done live trapping in several locations, and it's the small mammal community in these northern grasslands is pretty simple, and the density of prey seems pretty low. And the other thing is we don't have, it's very difficult to find a lizard in the grasslands. Whereas if you hop across the border and go a bit further south, there's fairly abundant lizards, and especially smaller rattlesnakes live on those quite a bit. So all told, the point I'm trying to make here is that naturally, these snakes have got a lot of obstacles. Then you throw in the things that we have thrown at rattlesnakes, and that includes the standard list, like I said, that most people know threaten the grasslands in overall, and certainly represent, more constraints on rattlesnakes. This the fifth bullet here, persecution, I do not think that is nearly as common or widespread as it was at one time. Certainly some rattlesnakes do get killed just out of fear, but I no longer think that's a significant impact on the snakes. But it may have had an impact in the past that we're still dealing with. And then there's one more big thing coming down the pipeline. It's not coming down the pipeline, it's here, and that's climate shifts or climate change. And in some ways, this may make it better for rattlesnakes. If you look at Vernon and the predictions for Vernon, just to pick one place, we're going to gain about 2 months between the last frost in the spring and the first frost in the fall. So potentially a lot more time for rattlesnakes to go out and feed, but it also depends on how the prey do. So what I'm getting at overall with this slide is that, we've got the natural limitations, and now we've got a whole pile more. And so I guess it's not too surprised that rattlesnakes are recognized as being threatened. Okay, so that's my background, which has prompted the need for research on rattlesnakes. And my lab's been involved in quite a few projects. As I said, I'm not going to be able to hit them all, but I'm going to try and at least showcase them. And I'll go fairly fast, but hopefully I can answer questions later on. The first one I want to, showcase is work done by my grad student, Marcus Atkins. And you'll see a constant theme here. Grad students are really the ones that drive this work. And Marcus went back to the Vernon site where I worked about 35 years ago. If you think back to that picture I showed of myself, and he replicated the study right down to how the snakes were captured, how they were searched for, you name it. And what's made this really interesting is that the study site from 35 years ago is now quite nicely divided between a provincial park, Cow Lake Provincial Park, which is on your left here as you're looking at this picture. And on the right is the Coldstream Cattle Ranch, which really hasn't changed much in operation over the years. And I could give a talk just on this, but suffice it to say that, we found that today, just as it was, 85 years ago, there's slightly lower numbers of snakes in the cattle ranch area, but that number has not changed as much over the last 35 years as it has in the park. So the park has dropped more, it seems. And some other interesting things, there's fewer snakes, it seems, but they are bigger. So it's like if you can get through that first crunch and make it and survive and actually join the population as an adult, you may have less competition from other snakes, more food to go around. And I'll tell you a little bit more later on in the talk about rattling behavior, because that's quite interesting. Another very interesting study is by my grad student Dana I, and she's been working at a Soyuz. And up to her study, we do a great deal about male rattlesnakes, but very little about females that were reproducing, and in particular, how they use rookeries. So I suspect there's a lot of bird watchers listening to me right now, and you're probably familiar with rookeries. Rookeries are places where females gather to reproduce or have their offspring. Rattlesnakes give birth to live young. They don't lay eggs. So once you find a rookery in the summer, it's not unusual to see several female rattlesnakes gathered there, warming themselves during the day and trying to safely have their babies. Now, so what is a rookery other than a pile of rocks? And Dana's done a lot of work to try and nail down what makes a rookery that special. Nothing big jumps out. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But why this is really significant for conservation is that we spend a lot of time worrying about dens and protecting dens, like this bottom picture. But let's face it, if the females can't have safe places to bear their young, the population's not going to do a whole lot better. Here's an example of 4 rookeries that Dana has located. And they don't look like much. You'd walk right by these without noticing them. But we do know that females will go back to the same rookery for different breeding attempts. New females will join, some females will move. Rookeries are often used as well for shedding, but they definitely are key to the successful reproduction of these females. Now, one of the really interesting things that Dana found that kind of blew us mind when she started was that when the females gave birth, we thought they would just collect themselves and head back to the den so they could safely be at the den for winter. And indeed, that's been kind of the standard narrative for rattlesnakes. Females, they give birth, they go back to the den, they spend another winter in hibernation, and then they come out and then they start looking for food. Well, what Dana found was at least half of her females did not go back to the den, even though we're talking quite late in the summer. They turned around and went downhill to presumably go feeding. We didn't know for sure, but we thought, why else would the females move away from the den late in the summer other than to get food or perhaps water? So Dana did a very interesting little experiment. She hypothesized that, well, if these snakes are really driven by the need to feed or get water, if we give those resources to them during the summer, even while they're preparing to give birth, they should not then leave the den area and go elsewhere. They should just head back to the den. And how she did this was she actually fed rattlesnakes in the field. So these are pregnant female rattlesnakes. She fed them using something like a fishing pole that has a warmed up mouse on it. And you can see right in the middle of the photo here, there is a warmed up deer mouse. So we trap deer mice, warm them up after bringing them in the field. And she would dangle these and get the snakes to come out. And this female's going to come out of here and take this mouse. She also took a bunch of these mice for certain snakes and also injected them with water. So now some females had all the food and all the water they could possibly want in the summer. Other females just had food, and then there were controls. So let's see if I can get this to play now. Here we go. So she's dangling that. You can see her shadow, and here comes the female. Wham, she gets it. And rattlesnakes with small prey, they do tend to hold on because I think they've realized they're not going to get hurt. Bigger animals, they might bite and release. Now Dana's just she's putting up a little bit of a fight just to make it a little bit more real for the snake. And then she drops the clip, or she pulls the clip off, and now the snake's left with the food. and you'll see she's going to try and swallow this sideways. I don't know if she was successful or not, but then she's going to decide, I'm just going to pull this back inside the rookery to finish eating. There she goes. And so what did we find? We found it didn't have any effect. Like the females, even though some of them were really chubby by the end of the summer, even though they gave birth, they still went hunting. So it's really telling us that they're driven by get as much energy back into their bodies as they possibly can, and then scoot up to the den late in the summer. And the water didn't seem to make any difference either. Okay, so let's move on to another one. Roads are a big issue for not just snakes, but a lot of grassland species. And we've got another study site. This is near White Lake and near Oliver, where about 4 different students have worked their way through doing different types of work, but it's all focused on understanding the impacts that roads have on the snakes. And the White Lake Road, I'm sure a lot of you have driven it, it's out past the observatory, does not get a lot of traffic. It gets about 500 cars a day at the peak of the summer, which is very small compared to, say, the main road in the Okanagan. But there's still a fair number of snakes that are killed. So our job, or what we decided to do, was go into this system and try to understand how many rattlesnakes were getting killed and what that was doing to the population. So we not only do road surveys, that is walking the roads middle of the night, middle of the day, counting the dead snakes, but we also monitor the populations through the den, going to the dens in the spring, marking a lot of animals and getting information that way. And one of the things we knew we had to correct for right at the start was scavengers. There's a lot of coyotes there, as you would expect. There's coyotes everywhere, and them and vultures and raptors and corvids and even some smaller mammals we knew were taking dead snakes off the road. So the question is, when you go out and you walk this road and you count the number of snakes, what proportion of the snakes that were killed do you actually find? And how does that change if it's 3 or 4 days between? So Stephanie did a lot of work putting dead snakes out on the road, which unfortunately weren't hard to come by, and setting up cameras, but also walking the roads and getting an idea on how quickly they disappeared. And then we can use that to correct our road kills. So really what we're getting at scavenger rates, and it's a little bit of a mathematical journey to calculate this, because you got to deal with the instantaneous appearance and disappearance of snakes off the road, but it can be done. And so we've now been able to use this to correct for our roadkill counts. And it's not great, the outcome from this sort of work. We didn't expect it would. Like for here, for example, is a nice big snake that's been killed prime of its life. Roadkill was actually about 2.7 times greater than what we detected. So for every snake we find on the road, there's another 2.7 we don't find. So huge numbers of snakes, and other places are taking the same approach now to get at this. That meant about close to 7% of the population was being killed each year. Not many populations of animals can take that, especially if it's on top of natural predation. And remember, as I said, this road doesn't have a lot of traffic. So because of this, Highways was redoing the road, and they collaborated, and they spent a fair bit of money putting in culverts for snakes to get under the roads at places we suggested. And these are pretty, we call them eco passages, but they're pretty skookum, and we try to build fences on either end to encourage snakes to use them, and we monitor these using cameras. And the cameras have shown us a lot of interesting things. I want to emphasize that camera work is a lot of fun and everybody loves seeing pictures of animals, but really the key thing is, do we change the road mortality rates and do we help the population improve? But we still have seen some interesting things. Here's 2 male rattlesnakes wrestling in a culvert, and we didn't really realize that male rattlesnakes this far north do wrestle one another. There's probably a female sitting just off the camera. But perhaps the most interesting thing we found is that racers, which is another endangered snake, are in the culverts way more often than the other species. And we don't know why. And that's something we're starting to work on right now. But here's, you see, here's even 2 racers heading through the culvert at roughly the same time. And racers get roadkilled a lot, but they also seem to use culverts a lot. So that's something we're now starting to explore as well. Another long-term study site is down in Osoyoos, where for almost 16 years now, we've been working with the Osoyoos Indian Band and Environment Climate Change Canada to look at how development has been affecting the snakes. And a lot of this is revolved around understanding fences or buildings. Sometimes they're there on purpose. This is a fence to keep snakes out of the campground on the left. But certainly every time buildings go up, there's a potential to interrupt snake movement and migration. And this work has shown us a lot of things that some we predicted and some we didn't. I just want to give you some perspective here. This is Osoyoos, taken from up on the mountain around 1926. And I don't know if it's clear, but that's the town of Osoyoos right there, just a little town on the edge of the lake. And fast forward about 100 years, and this is what we're looking at. And so Osoyoos is spread to both sides. A lot of the land is green. It looks pretty, but it's definitely not rattlesnake habitat anymore. But there is still some good habitat over here. So we've been working on this landscape, and one of the most interesting things we found is that with care and proper management, rattlesnakes seem to be able to persist in this landscape, but they're not often as fat or heavy for their size as they would be elsewhere. The other thing we started on recently is now adding on knowledge of juvenile rattlesnakes or even little pups. And this summer we started radio tracking these tiny little snakes to understand where they went and what their habitat was. And we were hoping to also maybe start learning how snakes start developing a migration pathway. But wow, we had another real big I guess obstacle thrown at us, and that was the fire at Osoyoos, which burnt up most of our study site and a large part of the rattlesnake habitat being used. So I guess trying to make lemons out of lemonade or lemonade out of lemons now, and hopefully this summer we can get money to go back out there and understand and track some snakes to see, do they travel through this? Do they actually go hunting in this? And how is the prey doing? So things always just keep changing. Okay, I'm going to wind down here pretty quick. I'm just going to throw a real quick slideshow of other projects, mention them very briefly. We're working with Trans Mountain Pipeline to understand how we can mitigate den destruction. So when dens are dug up in the course of a pipeline or any development, can we rebuild dens and how can we get snakes to reestablish it there? We've done a lot of radio tracking through all these studies. And one of the things they've shown us that's quite interesting is that rattlesnakes are not strictly a grassland species. They do go fairly high up in the mountains. At the Vernon site, we found them up as high as getting into cedar forests, and they're not hunting little mice anymore. They take things, larger animals like squirrels and even small hares. So probably there's better pay in terms of food up there, but it is cooler. So bottom line here is that we no longer think of just grasslands as being necessary to support rattlesnakes. We've been working at dens to understand how changes in temperature from year to year, but also perhaps long-term changes affect when snakes come out and when they come back to the dens, and what that may mean for the future when climate change happens. This is my collaborator, Robin Rudick from the Ministry of Flinrord. One last little thing that's really fun is, but also a bit alarming, is that at 2 sites now, we've determined that rattlesnakes living in areas with fairly heavy people traffic have really shut down a lot of their rattling response. They do not rattle as often or as far away from danger as you would think they might. And compared to controls, if you go into other areas like the cattle ranch or the undeveloped areas near a soyuz, the snakes are much more likely to rattle at a distance. So we're going to try and keep expanding this because we've only done it at 2 sites, but it's definitely something really interesting to think how possibly we're causing a change in rattlesnake behavior. So what's left to do? Lots. You know, I could go on now for another half hour on things that we still need to do. And I've given you some suggestions. I guess the fires are a big thing now. That's a big thing on our agenda, is trying to understand what that fire meant to the rattlesnakes. And the one animal I want to try and expand on to before I ride off into the sunset is the rubber boa. I think that's one of the last great unknown snakes we have in this province. And I'm starting to try and collect information on where rubber boa dens may be so that we could perhaps start doing some similar work with this really, really cool animal that's we just know nothing about. And with that, I will shut her down and say thanks for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'd be really happy to take them.